Picture a Kansas prairie at dusk. The wind sighs through tall grass, the sky glows with the last embers of sunlight, and somewhere, a secret is being buried deeper than any well. 5 brides, 5 graves, and not a single husband left behind. What darkness crept into Hollowell in 1876? Let me know which state you're listening from. We love to know where our listeners are tuning in. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that keep you up at night. Hollowell, Kansas was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, or at least thought they did. The town was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings, a church steeple, and a handful of farms stretching out into the endless prairie. Life was hard, but the people were proud, stubborn, some would say. They had to be, to survive the droughts, the grasshopper plagues, and the long, lonely winters. It was in the spring of 1871 that the first stranger arrived. He came on foot, carrying a battered suitcase and a smile that seemed to flicker at the edges. He called himself Samuel Reed, and he claimed to be a traveling merchant, selling ribbons, combs, and stories from places most Hollowell folk had only heard about in books. Samuel was a man of many words, quick to laugh, and quicker still to charm. He had a way of making people feel seen, as if he'd known them all his life. Samuel's attention soon settled on Mary Ellen Carter, the blacksmith's daughter. Mary Ellen was known for her beauty, hair the color of ripe wheat, eyes sharp as flint, and for her independence. She'd turned away more than one suitor, preferring the company of her father in the forge to the gossip of the other girls. But Samuel was different. He brought her wildflowers, recited poetry, and listened to her dreams of seeing the world beyond the prairie. Within a month they were engaged, and the whole town buzzed with excitement. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the church with the scent of lilacs drifting through the open windows. Mary Ellen wore a dress she'd sewn herself, and Samuel looked every bit the devoted groom. For a week they were inseparable, seen walking hand in hand along the riverbank, laughing in the golden light of evening. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Samuel was gone. He left no note, no explanation, just vanished, as if he'd never existed. Mary Ellen was inconsolable. She wore her wedding dress every day, her face pale and drawn, her eyes searching the horizon for any sign of her missing husband. The town whispered, some saying Samuel had run off with another woman, others insisting he'd met with foul play. A week after his disappearance, Mary Ellen's body was found near an old, abandoned well on the edge of town. She was still in her wedding gown, her veil tangled in the grass, her hands folded over a single white rose. She had been strangled, her face frozen in terror. The shock rippled through Hollowell like a stone thrown into still water. The sheriff searched for Samuel, but there was no trace, no footprints, no belongings, nothing but the memory of his smile and the echo of his promises. Mary Ellen was buried in the town cemetery, her wedding dress folded carefully at her feet. The well where she was found was boarded up, and the townsfolk tried to move on, though the shadow of her death lingered. A year passed. The prairie bloomed and faded, and the memory of Mary Ellen's tragedy began to blur at the edges. Then, in the summer of 1872, another stranger arrived. He introduced himself as Thomas Gray, a schoolteacher seeking work. He was taller than Samuel, with dark hair and a quiet, thoughtful manner. But there was something about his eyes, restless, watchful, as if he were always listening for footsteps behind him. Thomas soon became a fixture in the community, helping with the harvest, reading to the children, and attending Sunday services. He caught the eye of Abigail Turner, the preacher's daughter. Abigail was gentle, with a shy smile and a love of books. Thomas courted her with letters and long walks by the river, and within 2 months, they were married in a ceremony that brought the whole town together. But happiness was fleeting. A week after the wedding, Thomas disappeared, just as Samuel had. Abigail was left alone, her heart broken, her days spent wandering the fields in her wedding dress, searching for any sign of her missing husband. Then, as before, her body was found near the same abandoned well, strangled, her white gown stained with prairie dust, a single white rose resting on her chest. Panic swept through Hollowell. 2 brides, 2 graves, and no sign of the men who had married them. The townsfolk began to whisper that the 2 men were the same person, wearing different faces. Some claimed to have seen Samuel's eyes in Thomas's face, or the same crooked smile. Others insisted it was the work of a demon, or a curse placed on the town. The sheriff, desperate for answers, sent word to nearby towns asking if anyone had seen the mysterious men, but no one had. The only clue was the white rose, a flower that didn't grow anywhere near Hollowell. The town's women grew fearful, locking their doors at night and refusing to speak to strangers. But life had to go on, and soon, the memory of the 2 brides began to fade. In the autumn of 1873, a 3rd stranger arrived. He called himself William Hart, and he claimed to be a surveyor, mapping the land for the railroad. He was older than the previous men, with a graying beard and a limp, but his eyes were the same: cold, calculating, and impossible to read. William quickly became friendly with the townsfolk, sharing stories of his travels and buying drinks at the local saloon. He soon met Clara Benson, the daughter of the town's only doctor. Clara was lively and adventurous, with a quick wit and a love of music. William courted her with songs and promises of a life beyond the prairie. Within a month, they were married in a joyful ceremony, with music and dancing that lasted long into the night. But the happiness was short-lived. William disappeared a week after the wedding, just like the others. Clara was inconsolable, wandering the fields in her wedding dress, searching for any sign of her husband. And just like before, her body was found near the abandoned well, strangled and dressed in white. A single white rose lay on her chest. 3 brides, 3 graves, and a town gripped by fear. The people of Hollowell began to believe that the town was cursed, that something evil had taken root in the soil. The sheriff doubled his patrols, but it made no difference. The killer was always 1 step ahead, always watching, always waiting. Rumors grew like weeds in the cracks of Hollowell's dusty streets. Some said the well itself was cursed, that it called to the lonely and the lost, drawing them to their doom. Others whispered about the men, how each one seemed to know just what to say, how their eyes never quite matched their smiles. The town's elders remembered old stories from the old country, tales of shapeshifters and spirits that wore the faces of men. But most people just locked their doors and prayed that the evil would pass them by. The sheriff, a man named Amos Dillard, was not a superstitious man. He believed in evidence, in hard facts, and harder work. He spent his days riding the boundaries of the town, questioning travelers, and searching for any sign of the missing husbands. He even sent for a detective from Topeka, a city man with a sharp suit and sharper eyes. The detective, Mr. Leland, spent a week in Hollowell, interviewing everyone from the preacher to the stable boy. He left with a notebook full of names and a face pale as milk, muttering that some mysteries were better left unsolved. But the town could not forget. The well, once a place where children played and women drew water, became a place of dread. No one went near it, not even in daylight. The grass grew tall around its stones, and the boards that covered its mouth creaked in the wind. Some nights people claimed to hear weeping from the well, or to see a pale figure in a wedding dress drifting through the fields. Whether these were ghosts or just the fevered dreams of a frightened town, no one could say. In the spring of 1874, a 4th stranger arrived. He came by wagon with a team of tired horses and a trunk full of books. He called himself Elijah Crane, and he said he was a traveling preacher, spreading the word of God to the far corners of the prairie. Elijah was different from the others, older, with a voice like thunder and eyes that seemed to see straight through a person. He preached fire and brimstone from the steps of the church, warning of sin and salvation, and the townsfolk listened, hungry for hope. Elijah's sermons drew crowds, but it was his kindness that won hearts. He visited the sick, helped mend fences, and always had a gentle word for the children. He soon became close to Ruthie Miller, the schoolmistress. Ruthie was plain, with a quiet strength and a deep faith. She had lost her parents to fever and had built a life for herself in Hollowell, teaching the children their letters and numbers. Elijah courted her with scripture and song, and within weeks they were engaged. Their wedding was a somber affair, shadowed by the memory of the 3 brides who had come before. Ruthie wore a simple white dress, and Elijah looked every inch the devoted husband. For a few days it seemed as if the curse had lifted. Elijah and Ruthie were seen together at the church, in the schoolhouse, and walking hand in hand through the fields. But then, as before, Elijah vanished. No note, no sign, just an empty bed and a broken heart. Ruthie was found a week later, near the same abandoned well. She was dressed in her wedding gown, her hands folded over a single white rose. She had been strangled, her face peaceful, as if she had known her fate and accepted it. The town was plunged into mourning, and the whispers grew louder. 4 brides, 4 graves, and still no answers. By now, Hollowell was a town on edge. The women refused to speak to strangers, and the men carried rifles even to church. The sheriff organized nightly patrols, but nothing changed. The killer, whoever or whatever he was, seemed to move like a shadow, unseen and unstoppable. Some said the men were all the same, that the killer changed his face like a snake sheds its skin. Others believed the well itself was to blame, that it demanded a sacrifice every year. The town's preacher, Reverend Turner, called for a day of fasting and prayer. The church was packed, the air thick with fear and desperation. People wept and begged for mercy, but the sense of doom only deepened. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, lightning flashing over the prairie, thunder shaking the windows. Some said they saw a figure in white standing by the well, her veil blowing in the wind. Others heard a man's voice, low and mournful, singing an old wedding song. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the fear remained. The sheriff rode out to the well, his heart heavy. He found nothing but the boards, slick with rain, and the grass, flattened as if someone had knelt there in the night. He returned to town, his face grim, and told the people to stay away from the well, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the curse struck again. In the summer of 1875, the 5th and final stranger arrived. He was younger than the others, barely more than a boy, with a shock of red hair and a nervous smile. He called himself Peter Finch, and he said he was a farmhand looking for work. The townsfolk were wary, but Peter seemed harmless enough. He worked hard, kept to himself, and never went near the well. Peter soon caught the eye of Lila James, the miller's daughter. Lila was the youngest of the 5 brides, barely 17, with a laugh like wind chimes and a spirit that refused to be broken by fear. She and Peter spent their days working side by side, and their evenings talking by the river. Against her father's wishes, Lila agreed to marry Peter, insisting that love was stronger than any curse. Their wedding was a quiet affair, attended only by family and a few close friends. Lila wore her mother's wedding dress, and Peter looked both proud and terrified. For a week, they seemed happy, defying the darkness that hung over Hollowell. But then, as before, Peter disappeared. Lila searched for him, her hope fading with each passing day. A week later, her body was found near the well, dressed in white, a single rose on her chest. The town was silent, the grief too deep for words. 5 brides, 5 graves, and not a single husband found. The well was filled in, the ground salted, and the people of Hollowell tried to forget. But the memory lingered, a shadow on the prairie, a story whispered on the wind. After Lila's funeral, Hollowell was a changed place. The laughter that once drifted from the saloon was gone, replaced by the hush of suspicion and the weight of unspoken fears. The townsfolk moved through their days like ghosts, eyes averted, voices low. The well, now filled and salted, became a scar on the land, a place no one spoke of, but everyone remembered. The prairie itself seemed to mourn, the wind carrying the names of the lost brides across the fields. Sheriff Dillard, who had once been the heart of the town's resolve, found himself haunted by the faces of the 5 women. He kept their wedding portraits on his desk, staring into their eyes late at night, searching for something he'd missed. He replayed every detail of their stories, every word spoken by the strangers who had come and gone. He wondered if he'd failed them, if there was something he could have done to stop the cycle. The guilt gnawed at him, turning his hair gray and his hands unsteady. The townspeople, meanwhile, clung to their own explanations. Some believed the killer was still among them, hiding in plain sight, waiting for another chance. Others insisted the evil had left with the last bride, that the curse was finally broken. A few, mostly the old women who remembered the old country, whispered that the well was a doorway, an opening to something dark and hungry, something that demanded a price. But no one dared to dig too deep, not in the ground, and not in the past. As the months passed, the story of the Hollowell brides began to spread beyond the town. Travelers carried the tale to neighboring settlements where it grew with each retelling. Some said the brides had been chosen by fate, others that the men were all the same. An immortal killer, changing his face with each new victim. The legend took on a life of its own, twisting and growing until even the people of Hollowell could no longer separate truth from rumor. One autumn evening, nearly a year after Lila's death, a stranger arrived in Hollowell. He was a peddler, old and bent, with a wagon full of pots and pans. He set up shop in the town square, calling out his wares in a voice that cracked like dry leaves. The townsfolk avoided him at first, but curiosity got the better of them. They gathered around his wagon, listening as he told stories of haunted wells and lost brides in towns far away. The peddler's stories struck a nerve. Some of the details were eerily familiar. Wedding dresses, white roses, vanished husbands. When asked where he'd heard such tales, the peddler only smiled, his eyes glinting in the fading light. "Stories travel," he said, "sometimes faster than the wind." He left the next morning, but his words lingered, stirring old fears and new questions. Sheriff Dillard, restless and unable to sleep, began to pore over the old case files again. He noticed patterns he hadn't seen before, similarities in the handwriting of the marriage licenses, oddities in the descriptions of the men. Each stranger had given a different name, but their signatures shared a peculiar flourish, a looping R that seemed out of place. He wondered if the killer had left a clue, a mark of his true identity. Driven by a new sense of purpose, Dillard traveled to nearby towns, searching for records of similar crimes. In a dusty courthouse in Baxter Springs, he found a report of a woman found dead by a well, dressed in white, a rose on her chest. The date was 1868, 3 years before Samuel Reed arrived in Hollowell. The husband had vanished, leaving behind only a name, James Rowe. The handwriting on the marriage license was the same. Dillard's heart pounded as he traced the pattern further back. In town after town, he found the same story. A stranger arrives, marries a local woman, disappears, and the bride is found dead by a well. The names changed: Rowe, Reed, Gray, Hart, Crane, Finch. But the signature was always the same. The killer had been moving from town to town for years, maybe decades, always one step ahead, always leaving the same mark. Returning to Hollowell, Dillard shared his findings with Reverend Turner and a few trusted townsfolk. They pored over the evidence, piecing together the killer's path across the prairie. The realization was chilling. The man who had haunted Hollowell was not a ghost or a demon, but a flesh and blood killer, clever enough to change his face and name but not his hand. The townsfolk debated what to do. Some wanted to send word to the state authorities to hunt the man down and bring him to justice. Others feared that drawing attention would only bring more trouble, that the killer would slip away again, leaving another trail of bodies behind. In the end, they decided to keep watch, to warn their neighbors, and to trust no stranger who came to town. But even as they tried to move on, the memory of the brides lingered. Their graves, marked by simple stones and wildflowers, became a place of pilgrimage for those who remembered. Mothers warned their daughters never to trust a man who came from nowhere, never to walk alone near the well. The story became a cautionary tale, a warning passed down from one generation to the next. Years passed, and Hollowell slowly began to heal. New families arrived, children were born, and the town grew. The well, once a place of fear, was forgotten, its stones buried beneath grass and time. But on quiet nights, when the wind was just right, some claimed to hear the sound of laughter and weeping drifting across the fields, the voices of the Hollowell brides, calling out for justice or perhaps for peace. Sheriff Dillard grew old, his hair white as snow, his eyes clouded by memories. He never stopped searching for the man who had stolen so much from his town. In his final days, he wrote a letter to his successor, warning him to watch for the signs: a stranger with a charming smile, a wedding that comes too quickly, a bride who disappears. Evil wears many faces, he wrote, but it always leaves a mark. And so, the story of the Hollowell brides became part of the prairie itself, woven into the fabric of the land. The fields grew tall, the seasons turned, and life went on. But the memory of those 5 women and the mystery of the man who took them would never be forgotten. As the years slipped by, the legend of the Hollowell brides became more than just a story. It became a warning, a shadow that stretched across the prairie and settled in the hearts of those who called it home. Children grew up hearing the tale at their mothers' knees, their imaginations painting the vanished husbands as monsters, spirits, or worse. The older folks, those who had lived through the terror, kept their memories close, sharing them only in hushed voices when the wind howled and the lamps burned low. The town itself changed, as all towns do. New faces arrived, drawn by the promise of fertile land and a fresh start. The scars of the past were covered by new buildings, new laughter, and the steady rhythm of daily life. But beneath the surface, the old fears lingered. The well, though long since filled and forgotten by most, remained a place of unease. No one built near it, and the children dared each other to run past it at dusk, their shouts echoing across the empty fields. One summer, a traveling photographer came through Hollowell, offering to take portraits for a few coins. He set up his camera in the town square, capturing the faces of farmers, shopkeepers, and children with their Sunday-best smiles. When he asked about the 5 graves on the edge of the cemetery, the townsfolk grew quiet. An old woman, her hair white as the clouds, told him the story in a voice as thin as wind. The photographer listened, his eyes wide, and promised to remember. That photograph, a faded image of Hollowell's people standing solemnly in front of the church, would one day hang in a museum far away. Visitors would pause before it, reading the small plaque that mentioned the legend of the Hollowell brides. Some would shiver, imagining the lonely prairie nights and the mystery that had never been solved. But for those who lived in Hollowell, the story was more than a curiosity. It was a lesson, a reminder that evil could come in any form, even one that smiled and spoke kindly. The town's women became cautious, teaching their daughters to trust their instincts and to look for the signs. A stranger who asked too many questions, a man who seemed to know too much about the town's secrets, a suitor who appeared out of nowhere and pressed for marriage too soon. The men, too, became wary. They watched over their families, kept their rifles close, and made it clear that Hollowell was not a place for drifters or charmers. The sheriff's warning, passed down from Dillard to his successor and on again, became a kind of oath. Protect the town, trust your neighbors, and never forget the brides. Yet, as time wore on, the sharp edges of the story softened. The details blurred, the names faded, and the well became just another patch of grass. The new generation, born after the last bride was buried, grew up with only the faintest sense of dread. They heard the story at bedtime, but it seemed distant, almost like a fairy tale. The world was changing. Railroads were coming, new inventions promised to make life easier, and the old fears seemed less important. Still, every so often something would happen to remind the town of its past. A stranger would pass through and the old men would watch him with narrowed eyes. A young woman would disappear for a day, and the whole town would search the fields, hearts pounding with old terror. Each time the fear would fade, replaced by relief and a renewed determination to keep the past buried. But the past has a way of resurfacing, especially in places where the land remembers. One autumn, a drought struck the prairie, drying up the streams and turning the grass to brittle straw. The townsfolk dug new wells, searching for water, and in doing so, they uncovered old secrets. Near the site of the filled-in well, a group of boys found a scrap of lace yellowed with age, tangled in the roots of a cottonwood tree. They brought it to their mothers, who recognized the delicate pattern as the work of Mary Ellen Carter, the first bride. The discovery sent a shiver through the town. The sheriff, now a young man named Henry Lowe, ordered the area searched. They found nothing more. No bones, no clues, just the scrap of lace and the memory it stirred. But the find was enough to rekindle the old fears. The story of the Hollowell brides was told again, this time with new urgency, as if the land itself was reminding the people not to forget. That winter, a traveling preacher arrived in Hollowell. He was a tall man with a deep voice and a way of looking at people that made them uneasy. He spoke of sin and redemption, of the need to face the darkness within. Some of the townsfolk welcomed him, grateful for his sermons and his prayers. Others kept their distance, remembering how the last preacher to marry a Hollowell bride had vanished without a trace. The preacher stayed through the winter, helping with chores and visiting the sick. He seemed harmless enough, but the old women watched him closely, noting the way he lingered near the cemetery, the questions he asked about the well. When spring came, he moved on, leaving behind a congregation both comforted and unsettled. As the years passed, the story of the Hollowell brides faded once more, but it never disappeared. It became part of the town's identity, a thread woven through every family's history. The 5 graves, marked by simple stones and wildflowers, stood as silent witnesses to a mystery that would never be solved. And though the world outside Hollowell changed, railroads, telegraphs, and new faces arriving every year, the memory of the brides remained, a quiet warning whispered on the wind. In time, the story would be told by grandmothers to their grandchildren, by teachers to their students, by strangers passing through on their way to somewhere else. Each telling would add new details, new fears, and new hope that the evil had finally been laid to rest. But in Hollowell, the lesson was always the same. Trust is precious, and some secrets are best left undisturbed. Decades rolled by, and the prairie changed its face with every season. The old wooden buildings of Hollowell were replaced, one by one, with brick and stone. The railroad finally came, bringing with it a steady stream of newcomers and the promise of prosperity. Yet for all the progress, the town's heart remained tethered to the past. The story of the 5 brides was never far from anyone's mind, especially when the wind rattled the windows at night or when a stranger's footsteps echoed down Main Street. The cemetery, where the 5 graves stood in a neat row, became a place of quiet pilgrimage. On certain days, townsfolk would leave wildflowers or a sprig of prairie grass on the stones, a silent gesture of remembrance. Some said that if you visited at dusk, you might hear the faint rustle of silk or catch the scent of roses on the breeze, even though no such flowers grew nearby. The children dared each other to run between the graves, but even the bravest never lingered long. As the town grew, so did its stories. The legend of the Hollowell brides became a favorite subject for visiting journalists and writers. Some came seeking the truth, others simply looking for a good tale. They interviewed the oldest residents, pored over yellowed newspapers, and walked the fields where the well had once stood. Each left with their own version of the story, but none could explain the mystery that had haunted Hollowell for so long. One summer, a young woman named Alice Monroe arrived in town. She was a schoolteacher from the East, drawn by the promise of a new life and the challenge of teaching in a place with such a storied past. Alice was curious by nature, and it wasn't long before she heard whispers of the brides and the vanished husbands. She asked questions, listened to the old women's tales, and spent her evenings reading through the town's records by lamplight. Alice became fascinated by the details, the way each stranger had arrived alone, the speed with which each courtship had progressed, the eerie similarity of the deaths. She noticed, too, the fear that still lingered in the eyes of those who remembered. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the past to repeat itself. Alice wondered if the story was truly over, or if the killer might one day return. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alice walked to the edge of town, where the grass grew tall and the shadows stretched long. She stood by the spot where the well had once been, her mind racing with questions. Why had the killer chosen Hollowell? Why the wedding dresses, the white roses, the vanished men? Was it a ritual, a compulsion, or something darker still? As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw an old man, his face lined with age and sorrow. He introduced himself as Samuel Dillard, the grandson of the sheriff who had tried so hard to solve the case. Samuel carried with him a battered notebook, its pages filled with his grandfather's notes and observations. He offered to share what he knew, and together, they sat beneath the cottonwoods as the sky faded to indigo. Samuel told Alice about the patterns his grandfather had uncovered, the matching signatures, the trail of similar crimes in other towns, the sense that the killer was always just out of reach. He spoke of the fear that had gripped Hollowell, the way the town had changed, and the burden of carrying a mystery that had no answer. Alice listened, her curiosity deepening into something like resolve. Over the following weeks, Alice and Samuel pored over the old records, comparing notes and searching for connections. They wrote letters to other towns, asking about unsolved cases and missing husbands. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, a web of tragedy stretching across the prairie, each thread leading back to a man who changed his name but not his methods. The killer, it seemed, had been moving for decades, always seeking out small towns, always leaving the same mark. Their investigation drew the attention of the townsfolk, some of whom were eager for answers, while others wished the past would stay buried. Alice found herself both welcomed and shunned, depending on whom she spoke to. Some saw her as a meddler, stirring up old pain. Others saw her as a chance for closure, a way to finally put the brides to rest. One night, as a storm raged outside, Alice sat by her window, reading through a stack of letters from distant towns. Lightning flashed, illuminating a passage that made her heart race, a description of a man who had arrived in a town in Nebraska, married a local woman, and vanished after her death. The handwriting on the marriage license was identical to the ones in Hollowell. The date was 1882, years after the last bride had died. Alice realized with a chill that the killer had not stopped. He had simply moved on, finding new places, new victims. The pattern was clear, but the motive remained elusive. Was it hatred, madness, or something even more unfathomable? She wondered if the man was still alive, still out there, wearing a new face and planning his next wedding. Determined to warn others, Alice wrote an article for the local paper, detailing the pattern of the crimes and urging vigilance. She described the killer's methods, the signs to watch for, and the importance of trusting one's instincts. The article was reprinted in neighboring towns, and soon, word spread across the prairie. People began to look at strangers with new suspicion, and the legend of the Hollowell brides took on a new life. A warning, not just a story. For Alice, the investigation became a calling. She continued to search for answers, traveling to other towns, speaking with families who had lost daughters and wives. Each story was heartbreakingly similar, and each added another piece to the puzzle. Though she never found the killer, her work brought comfort to those who had lived in fear, and her name became linked with the legend she had helped to keep alive. In Hollowell, life went on. The fields turned green in spring, gold in summer, and brown in autumn. The 5 graves remained, tended by those who remembered, and the story of the brides was told anew with each passing year. The mystery was never solved, but the lesson endured. Evil can wear any face, and sometimes the past is never truly gone. As Alice Munro's warnings echoed across the prairie, Hollowell settled into a wary peace. The townspeople grew more vigilant, and the story of the 5 brides became a living part of their daily caution. Young women were taught to be careful with their trust, and the men of the town kept a close watch on newcomers, especially those who arrived alone and asked too many questions. The legend, once a source of fear, became a shield, an invisible barrier that protected Hollowell from the unknown. But legends have a way of growing, twisting, and taking on a life of their own. As the years passed, the story of the Hollowell brides was retold in countless ways. Some said the killer was a restless spirit, doomed to wander the earth in search of forgiveness. Others believed he was a man possessed, driven by a darkness he could not escape. A few even whispered that the well itself was to blame, that it had been cursed long before the town was founded, and that the brides were simply the latest victims in a much older tale. Children played games inspired by the legend, daring each other to recite the names of the brides at midnight, or to leave a white rose on the old well's site. The bravest would sneak out after dark, hearts pounding, convinced they might see a ghostly bride drifting through the fields. Most returned home with nothing more than a story to tell, but every so often, a child would come back pale and silent, unwilling to speak of what they'd seen or heard. Meanwhile, Alice continued her work, traveling from town to town, gathering stories and searching for patterns. She became something of a local celebrity, known as the bride hunter in newspapers and whispered conversations. Her presence brought comfort to some and unease to others. In every town she visited, she found echoes of Hollowell's tragedy: women lost, husbands vanished, and a community left with more questions than answers. One autumn, Alice received a letter from a small town in Oklahoma. The handwriting was shaky, the words hurried. The writer, a woman named Martha, claimed her sister had married a stranger who matched the description Alice had published in her articles. The man had vanished a week after the wedding, and Martha's sister was found dead near an old well, dressed in her wedding gown, a white rose on her chest. The pattern was unmistakable. Alice traveled to Oklahoma, her heart heavy with dread. She met with Martha, listened to her story, and examined the evidence. The marriage license bore the same looping R in the signature, the same careful script. The sheriff in that town, a grizzled man with tired eyes, admitted he'd heard of the Hollowell brides but had never believed the story. Until now. Together, Alice and the sheriff pieced together the timeline. The killer had moved steadily south and west, always choosing small, isolated towns, always targeting women who were well-loved and well-known. He blended in, became part of the community, and then vanished without a trace. The only clues he left behind were the wedding dress, the white rose, and the empty well. Alice's investigation drew the attention of lawmen and journalists across the region. Soon, she was joined by others, detectives, reporters, and even a few amateur sleuths, all eager to solve the mystery that had haunted the prairie for so long. They shared information, compared notes, and mapped the killer's path across the country. The pattern was clear, but the man himself remained a ghost, always one step ahead. Back in Hollowell, the townsfolk followed Alice's progress with a mix of pride and anxiety. Some hoped she would finally bring the killer to justice, while others feared that stirring up the past would only invite more tragedy. The 5 graves became a symbol of both loss and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of evil, the town had endured. As the years passed, Alice's search became more difficult. The killer's trail grew colder, the towns more distant, the memories more faded. Some began to doubt that he was still alive, while others believed he had simply changed his methods, blending in even more completely with the world around him. Alice herself grew older, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes sharp but weary. One winter, as snow fell softly over the prairie, Alice returned to Hollowell. She visited the graves of the brides, leaving a white rose on each stone. She stood in silence, remembering the women whose lives had been stolen, the families left behind, and the mystery that had never been solved. She wondered if the killer had ever felt remorse, if he had ever looked back at the trail of sorrow he had left behind. That night, Alice sat by the fire in the old boarding house, reading through her notes one last time. She realized that the story of the Hollowell brides was no longer just about the killer. It was about the town, the people who had survived, and the lessons they had learned. It was about the power of memory, the importance of vigilance, and the strength that comes from facing the darkness together. As dawn broke over the prairie, Alice made her decision. She would continue her search not just for the killer, but for the truth. She would tell the story of the Hollowell brides wherever she went, warning others, sharing what she had learned, and keeping the memory of the brides alive. She knew that the mystery might never be solved, but she also knew that some stories are too important to forget. In Hollowell, life continued. The fields turned green again, the children grew up, and the town changed with the times. But the legend of the 5 brides remained, a thread woven through every family's history, a story told around every hearth. And somewhere, out on the endless prairie, the wind carried their names, a reminder that even the darkest secrets cannot stay buried forever. As Alice's journey stretched into the twilight of her life, the story of the Hollowell brides became a kind of living folklore, not just in Kansas, but across the Midwest. Her name was spoken with respect in towns that had never known her, and her letters were passed from hand to hand, each page worn thin by the touch of those searching for answers. She had become a keeper of memories, a guardian of the lost, and though she never found the man who haunted her dreams, she gave voice to the women who could no longer speak for themselves. In Hollowell, the passage of time softened the sharpest edges of grief, but the story never truly faded. The 5 graves, now shaded by a stand of cottonwoods, became a place where people came to reflect, to mourn, and to remember. On the anniversary of each bride's death, someone, no one ever saw who, would leave a single white rose on every stone. Some believed it was Alice herself. Others thought it might be a family member or perhaps a stranger who felt the weight of the story as deeply as those who had lived it. The town's children, now grown, carried the legend with them wherever they went. Some left Hollowell for the cities, seeking lives untouched by the shadow of the well. But even they found themselves telling the story to new friends, warning them to be wary of strangers who arrived with too many secrets. The tale became a kind of inheritance, a lesson passed down through generations, shaping the way people saw the world and each other. One spring, a young journalist named Henry Bell arrived in Hollowell, drawn by the legend and the hope of uncovering something new. He was ambitious, eager to make his mark, and convinced that the story of the Hollowell brides still held secrets waiting to be revealed. He spent his days interviewing the oldest residents, poring over Alice's notes and walking the fields where the well had once stood. He listened to the stories, the rumors, and the half-remembered details, piecing together a tapestry of fear, hope, and resilience. Henry was struck by the way the town had changed, and yet in some ways remained the same. The people were proud, cautious, and fiercely protective of their own. They welcomed him with polite smiles, but he could sense the wariness beneath their words. He learned that the story of the brides was not just a tale of tragedy, but a testament to the strength of a community that had survived the unthinkable. As he dug deeper, Henry uncovered a few details that had been overlooked. In the town's archives, he found a faded letter written by Sheriff Amos Dillard to his son, describing a dream he'd had in the final years of his life. In the dream, the 5 brides stood together by the well, their faces serene, their hands joined. They spoke not of vengeance, but of peace, urging the living to let go of fear and embrace the future. The letter ended with a simple plea: remember them, but do not let them haunt you. Live, and let the prairie heal. Henry included the letter in his article, which was published in newspapers across the state. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from readers who had lost loved ones, who had their own stories of tragedy and survival. Some shared tales of similar crimes in distant towns. Others simply offered words of comfort and solidarity. The story of the Hollowell brides, once a source of fear and suspicion, became a symbol of endurance and hope. In the years that followed, Hollowell continued to grow and change. The railroad brought new opportunities, and the town flourished. The old fears faded, replaced by a cautious optimism. The well, long since filled and forgotten, became a footnote in the town's history, a reminder of a time when darkness had threatened to consume everything. But the memory of the brides endured, not as a curse, but as a call to vigilance and compassion. Alice Munro, now elderly and frail, returned to Hollowell one last time. She visited the graves, her steps slow but steady, and placed a white rose on each stone. She sat beneath the cottonwoods, listening to the wind, and felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She knew that the story would outlive her, that the lessons learned would be carried forward by those who came after. She had done what she could, and now it was time to rest. On her final night in Hollowell, Alice wrote a letter to the town, thanking them for their courage and their kindness. She urged them to remember the brides, not as victims, but as women who had loved and been loved, whose lives had touched everyone around them. She reminded them that evil could never truly win, so long as people stood together and refused to let fear rule their hearts. After Alice's passing, the town held a small ceremony in her honor. People gathered by the graves, sharing stories and memories and promising to keep the legend alive. The white roses continued to appear each year, a silent tribute to the women who had been lost, and to the woman who had refused to let them be forgotten. As the prairie stretched out beneath the endless sky, Hollowell stood as a testament to the power of memory, the strength of community, and the enduring hope that even the darkest mysteries can one day give way to light. The story of the Hollowell brides lived on, not just in the town's history but in the hearts of all who heard it. A reminder that some stories are worth telling, and some lessons are never truly learned until they are lived. Years drifted by, and the world outside Hollowell changed in ways the old settlers could never have imagined. Automobiles rumbled down the main street where once only horses had trod. Electric lights replaced lanterns, and the telegraph wires that once hummed with distant news gave way to the telephone's ring. Yet for all the progress, the story of the Hollowell brides remained a constant, woven into the fabric of the town, a quiet refrain that echoed through every generation. The 5 graves, shaded now by mature cottonwoods and surrounded by a low iron fence, became a place of gentle pilgrimage. School children visited on field trips, their teachers telling the story not to frighten, but to teach. The lesson was always the same: trust is precious, and evil can wear a friendly face. The children would leave wildflowers or pebbles on the stones, and sometimes in the hush of late afternoon, a teacher would pause, her voice trembling just a little as she recited the names of the brides. In the town's small library, Alice Munro's letters and notes were preserved in a glass case. Visitors from far and wide came to read her careful handwriting, to trace the looping R that had haunted her for so many years. Some came seeking answers, others simply to pay their respects. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, took pride in showing the collection to anyone who asked, her own voice soft with reverence for the woman who had given so much of her life to the search for truth. The legend of the Hollowell brides began to attract attention from beyond Kansas. Folklorists, historians, and even a few skeptics arrived, eager to separate fact from fiction. They interviewed the oldest residents, pored over the archives, and walked the fields where the well had once stood. Some left convinced that the story was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a prairie ghost story spun from grief and fear. Others, however, felt the weight of the past pressing in around them, and left Hollowell with a new respect for the mysteries that linger in quiet places. One summer, a group of university students arrived, led by a professor of American folklore. They spent weeks in Hollowell, recording oral histories, mapping the town's landmarks, and collecting every version of the story they could find. They discovered that over time, the details had shifted and changed. In some tellings, the killer was a shapeshifter, able to become anyone he wished. In others, he was a cursed soul, doomed to wander the earth until he found forgiveness. A few versions even suggested that the well itself was a portal, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. Despite the variations, certain details remained constant. The 5 brides, the vanished husbands, the white roses, and the well. The students compiled their findings into a book, which was published and read by people across the country. The story of the Hollowell brides became part of the larger tapestry of American folklore, a tale told around campfires and in classrooms, a reminder that some mysteries are never truly solved. Back in Hollowell, life continued at its own pace. The town celebrated its centennial with a parade, a picnic, and a special ceremony at the cemetery. Descendants of the brides, some of whom had moved far away, returned to pay their respects. They shared stories, photographs, and memories, weaving their own lives into the legend that had shaped their families. The sense of community was strong, a bond forged in sorrow, but tempered by hope. As the years passed, the story of the Hollowell brides became less about fear and more about resilience. The townspeople took pride in their history, in the way they had faced darkness and endured. The well, once a symbol of dread, was now marked by a simple plaque, its story told with honesty and compassion. The children who once ran past it in fear now played nearby, their laughter a testament to the healing power of time. Yet even as the story softened, it never lost its edge. Every so often a stranger would arrive in Hollowell, and the old wariness would flicker in the eyes of the townsfolk. They would watch, wait, and remember the lessons of the past. The sheriff, now a woman named Ruth Dillard, descended from the original sheriff, kept Alice Monroe's notes in her office, a reminder that vigilance was the town's best defense. Ruth took her role seriously, not just as a lawkeeper, but as a guardian of the town's memory. She spoke at schools, led tours for visitors, and made sure the story of the brides was told with respect. She believed that remembering the past was the surest way to protect the future. Under her watch, Hollowell remained a safe place, but never a complacent one. One autumn evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, Ruth walked to the cemetery. She paused by the 5 graves, her hand resting on the cool iron fence. She thought of the women who had been lost, of Alice Monroe and her tireless search, of her own family's place in the story. She whispered a promise to the wind, that she would never let the memory fade, that she would keep watch, just as her ancestors had. As darkness fell, the town's lights flickered on, one by one, casting a warm glow over the fields. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of laughter. In that moment, Hollowell felt both timeless and new, a place shaped by its past but always looking forward. The story of the Hollowell brides lived on, not as a curse, but as a legacy of courage, caution, and community. And so, as the prairie night settled in, the legend continued, whispered in the hush of the wind, written in the pages of old letters, and carried in the hearts of all who called Hollowell home. As the decades continued to unfold, Hollowell's story became a touchstone for those who believed in the power of memory and the necessity of vigilance. The town's elders, who had once been children listening wide-eyed to the tale, now found themselves the keepers of its truth. They gathered each year on the anniversary of the last bride's death, not in fear, but in solemn remembrance. The ceremony was simple, a reading of the bride's names, a moment of silence, and the placing of 5 white roses on the graves. It was a ritual that bound the community together, a promise renewed with every generation. The world outside Hollowell grew ever more complex. News traveled faster, people moved farther, and the old boundaries between towns and cities blurred. Yet, the legend of the Hollowell brides remained rooted in its place, a story that belonged to the prairie and to the people who had lived through its darkest days. Visitors still arrived, drawn by curiosity or a need to understand how a small town could endure such sorrow and still find hope. Among those visitors was a young woman named Clara Evans, a graduate student researching American folklore. She arrived one spring, notebook in hand, eager to hear the story from those who had inherited it. Clara was welcomed by Ruth Dillard, who had become something of a local historian as well as sheriff. Ruth led her through the town, pointing out the landmarks, the site of the old well, the church where the brides had been wed, the cemetery where their stories ended. Clara listened, asked questions, and recorded every detail. She was struck by the way the story had changed over time, shaped by the needs and fears of each generation. In some versions, the killer was a warning against trusting outsiders. In others, he was a symbol of the dangers that lurked in the hearts of men. But always, the brides were remembered not just as victims but as women who had loved, hoped, and lived. During her stay, Clara spent hours in the library, poring over Alice Munro's letters and the notes left by generations of sheriffs. She traced the looping R through marriage records and newspaper clippings, marveling at the persistence of the mystery. She interviewed townsfolk, gathering their memories and their theories, and found that even those who claimed not to believe in the legend still locked their doors at night and watched strangers with careful eyes. One evening, Clara joined Ruth and a few others at the cemetery. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose. As they placed the white flowers on the graves, Ruth spoke quietly about the importance of remembering, not just the tragedy, but the strength that had come from it. "We're not defined by what happened," she said, her voice steady. "We're defined by how we carried on, how we looked out for each other, and how we refused to let fear win." Clara was moved by the sense of community, by the way the story had become a source of unity rather than division. She realized that the legend of the Hollowell brides was more than a cautionary tale. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She wrote about her experiences, weaving together the voices of the past and present, and her work was published in journals and anthologies, ensuring that the story would reach new audiences far beyond the prairie. Back in Hollowell, life continued its steady rhythm. The children grew up, the fields were planted and harvested, and the seasons turned as they always had. The story of the brides was told at bedtime, at school assemblies, and around campfires. It became a way for parents to teach their children about trust, about the importance of community, and about the need to face the darkness with courage and compassion. The well, now nothing more than a patch of wildflowers and a weathered plaque, remained a place of quiet reflection. Some said they still felt a chill when they passed by, a reminder of the sorrow that had once haunted the town. Others saw it as a symbol of healing, proof that even the deepest wounds could be transformed by time and care. As Ruth Dillard grew older, she began to train her niece Emily to take her place as sheriff and storyteller. Emily listened carefully, learning not just the facts of the case, but the lessons that had been passed down through the years. She understood that her role was not just to keep the peace, but to keep the memory alive, to ensure that the story of the Hollowell brides would never be forgotten, and that the town would always be ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. On the eve of her retirement, Ruth stood once more by the 5 graves, the prairie wind tugging at her hair. She felt the weight of the years, the sorrow and the hope, the fear and the strength. She knew that the story would outlive her, that it would be told and retold as long as Hollowell stood. And she was content, knowing that she had done her part to honor the brides, to protect her town, and to pass on the lessons of the past. As the stars appeared overhead, Ruth whispered a final promise to the women whose lives had shaped her own. "You are remembered, you are loved, and you will never be lost to the prairie wind." The words drifted out across the fields, mingling with the night, a quiet benediction for all who had come before and all who would come after. And so, the legend of the Hollowell brides endured, etched into the land, carried in the hearts of the people and whispered on the wind that swept across the endless Kansas prairie. As the years continued their steady march, Hollowell's story became more than a local legend. It became a living thread in the tapestry of the American heartland. The tale of the 5 brides, their vanished husbands, and the well that had once been the center of so much sorrow, was now a story that belonged to everyone who had ever loved, lost, or wondered about the secrets that linger in quiet places. Emily Dillard, now sheriff, took up her Aunt Ruth's mantle with a sense of both duty and reverence. She understood that her role was not just to enforce the law, but to be a steward of the town's memory. She kept Alice Munro's letters and the old case files in a locked drawer in her office, but she also kept them close to her heart. Whenever a new family moved to Hollowell, Emily would invite them to the library, show them the display of artifacts, and tell them the story, not to frighten, but to remind them that every community is shaped by the shadows it has faced and the light it has chosen to carry forward. The town itself had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The old saloon was now a cafe, where people gathered to share news and laughter. The church where the brides had once been wed hosted weddings still, but also book clubs, music nights, and community suppers. The cemetery, with its 5 white stones, was lovingly tended by volunteers, and every spring, the wild roses that had once been a symbol of loss now bloomed in abundance, a sign of hope and renewal. Visitors continued to arrive, drawn by the legend and the sense of something enduring in the air. Some came to pay their respects, others to seek inspiration for their own stories. A few came hoping to solve the mystery once and for all, but most left with a deeper understanding that some questions are meant to remain unanswered, and that the true meaning of a story often lies not in its ending, but in the way it is carried and cherished. Emily found herself reflecting often on the lessons the Hollowell brides had left behind. She saw how the story had taught the town to be cautious but not closed, to remember, but not to be ruled by fear. She watched as children played near the old well's site, their laughter ringing out where once there had been only silence. She listened as elders told the story in their own words, each version a little different, but all carrying the same core of truth: that love and loss are intertwined, and that the strength of a community is measured by how it cares for its most vulnerable. One autumn, on the anniversary of the last bride's death, Emily organized a gathering at the cemetery. People came from all over, descendants of the brides, townsfolk, and even strangers who had heard the story and felt its pull. They brought candles, flowers, and letters, laying them gently on the graves. There were tears, but also laughter, as memories were shared and old wounds acknowledged. Emily spoke softly, her words carrying on the wind. We remember not just the sorrow, but the courage, not just the loss, but the love that endures. As dusk settled over the prairie, the group stood in silence, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. In that moment, the past and present seemed to merge, and the story of the Hollowell brides felt as alive as it had ever been. The candles flickered, casting a warm glow over the stones, and for a brief shining moment, it was as if the brides themselves were there, no longer lost but held in the hearts of all who remembered. In the days that followed, life in Hollowell returned to its gentle rhythm. The fields were harvested, the school bell rang, and the cafe filled with the hum of conversation. But the story lingered, a quiet presence in every corner of the town. It was there in the way neighbors looked out for one another, in the way children were taught to trust their instincts, and in the way the community came together in times of need. Emily knew that the legend would continue to evolve, shaped by the voices of those who told it and the lives of those who lived it. She hoped that in the years to come, the story would serve not just as a warning, but as a beacon, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there is always a way forward, and that the bonds of love and community are stronger than any shadow. And so, the Hollowell brides became more than a mystery. They became a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the enduring power of memory. Their story, once a source of fear, was now a source of strength, a thread that bound the town together and reached out to all who heard it. As long as the wind whispered through the prairie grass and the wild roses bloomed each spring, the legend would live on, reminding everyone that some stories and some lives are never truly lost. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the haunting legend of the Hollowell brides. Stories like this one remind us that every town, no matter how small, carries its own mysteries and memories, woven into the land, whispered on the wind, and kept alive by those who remember. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened in Hollowell all those years ago? Do you believe the truth was ever uncovered? Or do you think some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved? Maybe you have your own family legends or hometown stories that echo the shadows and resilience of Hollowell. Share your reflections, theories, or even your own experiences in the comments below. Your voice is part of what keeps these stories alive. And if you enjoyed this series, don't forget to subscribe and let us know which state you're listening from. We're always fascinated by how far these tales travel and how they connect us across miles and generations. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your heart brave, and remember, every story leaves a mark, and every listener becomes a part of the legend.